discussion jointly organized by the SLIDA and the SLA's 2009 intake. Redesigned capacity development program envisages to open avenues for policy dialogues through panel discussions and workshops with the participation of public sector, private sector, academia, industry experts, think tanks, trade unions, civil society, etc., on contemporary socio-economic issues under the banner of SLIDA Forum. It is expected that the clashes of ideas and insights will enrich policy debates and policy-making process, which will have positive impacts. This is the second of a series of panel discussions jointly organized by the SLIDA and SLA's 2009 intake, where the first panel discussion recently conducted on value for money in public and private sector perspective. As a nation, we are in a critical juncture where policy inactions today will definitely determine the prosperity or failure of the country in future. In the economic policy reform agenda, SOE reforms take a prominent place. Restructuring SOEs is important for more efficient allocation of resources, foster competition, and boost productivity. In this slide, this panel discussion on Sri Lanka at Crossroads, restructuring of state-owned enterprises and impacts beyond will explore the SOE reform discourse in great detail with valuable insights of the following panel of experts representing the government, academia, trade unions, and think tanks. Mr. Suresh Shah, Director General, SOE Restructuring Unit, Ministry of Finance, Economic Stabilization and National Policies. Dr. Chathura Liyanage, Senior Lecturer, Department of Finance, University of Kelaniya. Mr. Peter D. Almeida, Deputy General Secretary, the Ceylon Mercantile Industrial and General Workers Union. Mr. Dharanath Fernando, Chief Executive Officer, Advocata. With that brief introduction, may I welcome distinguished invitees who have come to grace this occasion. Members of the Governing Council SLIDA, other distinguished invitees, members of the gathering, presence here today is a great honor for us. While welcoming you all again, I would like to hand over to our moderator of the program, Mrs. Dulanjali Ananda, to conduct from here on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Chaturani Siriratna. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of SLIDA, Sri Lanka Institute of Development and Administration, it gives me great pleasure to welcome each of you for this panel discussion titled Sri Lanka at Crossroads, Restructuring of State-Owned Enterprises and Impacts Beyond. It's organized by SLA's 2009 intake under the banner Sri Lanka SLIDA Forum Cross-Sector Leadership Program. Now, as Sri Lankans, we have been going through a tough time over the past few years. Be it the Easter Sunday attacks, the COVID pandemic, and now an unprecedented economic crisis that, as a whole, each and every one of us are going through. So it is also crucial that we, as citizens, learn better and understand better what these problems are. It's always discussed in the, at homes and in the forums, but we have to understand better in detail as to what has caused these problems, and we deserve to understand what would be the solutions which will derive out of these impacts that they will be implementing as strategic and policies that will be implemented in a state level, and also have to have a dialogue to understand better for a better understanding for the future as citizens. So SLIDA has recognized this vital need of an open discussion at the critical juncture. So today's forum is to facilitate a productive conversation among key stakeholders representing the state, the academic and economic experts, private and public and employee sectors. So in order to encourage a better understanding and challenges Sri Lanka is facing, and how and what would be the measures be taken in order to overcome these economic crises we are facing. On a large context, in the context of unprecedented economic crisis and the socio-economic challenges, it is mandatory to implement prudent macroeconomic policies and structural reforms in order to restore macroeconomic stability and debt sustainability, safeguard financial stability, mitigate economic impact on the poor and vulnerable, and strengthen governance as well as unlock growth potential. In terms of Extended Fund Facility, or the EFF agreement signed with the IMF, the Sri Lankan government is bound to carry out SOE reforms in a timely manner to meet conditions presented for the disbursement of fund under EFF. So we are also privileged by the presence of the Director General, SOE's Restructuring Unit of Ministry of Finance. And it is my pleasure to now welcome him to the lectern to deliver the keynote address. And please join me as we welcome on stage. Also, I'll take a moment to introduce him formally. Mr. Suresh Shah is a fellow member of the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Sri Lanka. He is the past chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce and the Employers Federation of Ceylon. Previously, he has served as a commissioner of the Securities and Exchange Commission, a member of Council of the University of Moratuwa, and a member of the Monetary Policy Consultative Committee of the Central Bank. He served as a CEO and board member of a public listed company for 30 years prior to retirement. He currently sits as an independent, not executive director on a number of listed and private sector entities, whilst serving as chairman of 2 of them. He currently heads the SOE Reform Unit. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Mr. Suresh Shah.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start by saying it's a privilege for me to be here this afternoon to speak to SLIDA on a subject that is not just important, but also a subject that is close to my heart. Close to my heart because it's something that I truly believe in. So I'm grateful for SLIDA for having invited. Very pleased to be here with you this afternoon. Now, usually in sessions like this, what happens is the audience asks the speakers questions, but I want to turn that around a little bit, and I want to start by asking y'all a question. So this is not a trick question. It's a very straightforward, very simple question, so please feel free and answer me, okay? How many of y'all actually eat fish? Please, can you raise your hand? Right, so quite a few of you. How many of you all actually catch the fish that you eat? So one. Everyone else tends to get their fish in a different way, right? And there are plenty of options available. So one is obviously you get in a boat every morning or every evening, go out to sea, go out to a lake, go out to a river, catch your fish and come and eat it. That's one way. You can also go to the fish stall in the town and you can buy the fish there. As a child, I remember there was the guy selling fish on a bike used to come down the lane and say malu malu, and you could buy the fish from him. You could also go to the supermarket and you could buy the fish. And of course, in today's context, when everything is online, you could even place an order for your fish online, right? So you have many different options available to get the fish that you want to eat. Now, this is true of practically anything and everything. But you haven't, and in making this choice, in terms of how you get your fish, you look at different options, right? I mean, you look at different things. You look at convenience, you look at price, you look at the time it's going to take you, and so on and so forth. So you have different considerations that go through your mind before you take the final call and say, this is how I'm going to get my fish. Now, this is true of everything. And even when it comes to government, this is also true. So you just think of again, going back to my example of the fish, what you're doing is you're satisfying a need. Now, in the case of governments, what governments have to do is actually satisfy a responsibility, because governments have responsibilities and they need to satisfy those responsibilities so that as citizens, we have a better standard of living. That's fundamentally the responsibility of government. Now, when you look at responsibilities of government, there are many responsibilities they have. So one example would be national security. Another example would be law and order. A third responsibility was creating the right kind of policy framework, whether it's economic policy or foreign policy or whatever the policy frameworks that give all of us a decent standard of living. They also are responsible for things like education and healthcare and so on and so forth. Now, they are also responsible for something very fundamental, which is to make sure that citizens of the country have access to essential goods and services. That is a primary fundamental responsibility of government. Now, it's important to understand the term essential goods and services. Now, the young lady, when she introduced me, said that I was a CEO of a company for 30 years. That was a beer company, and I can't classify beer as an essential product or service, right? So you have to be very careful in this definition. We are talking about essential goods and services. Now, even when it comes to government, when they are fulfilling this responsibility of essential goods and services, of the supply of essential goods and services to make sure that citizens have access to them, they have different choices, just like in the case of your eating fish. The choices that they have in front of them start with actually providing those essential goods and services themselves from government itself. Like, say, in the case of, say, the Ceylon Electricity Board, it does provide us the power that we need, but it has other mechanisms as well. So it can, for example, it can ask the private sector to provide you those goods and services. And it has different mechanisms. Now, in terms of the essential goods and services, what are you as citizens looking for? You're looking first for a decent price. Secondly, you're looking for decent quality. And thirdly, you're looking for easy accessibility. So in the provision of these goods and services, the government has many mechanisms that it can use to ensure that you and me as citizens get the essentials at a good price, at a decent quality, and at the right level of availability. So just as in the case of eating fish, government needs to look at this in terms of how it ensures this supply. Does it supply it on its own, or does it supply it through another source? And in making this decision, just like we do in buying the fish, it has to look at the different possibilities, see what is the least cost, see what provides the best value, and see which is most convenient, not just for the government, but also for the citizens, and so on and so forth, right? So again, it needs to go through this process. And when you look at it from this point of view, just like for all of us, the resources that a government has is limited. No government has unlimited resources. So the government needs, when it looks at these different options in front of it, in order to discharge its different responsibilities, be it education, be it healthcare, be it national security, be it law and order, be it in the supply of essential goods and services, it needs to ask itself, how best do I use these resources that I have? Where do I put these resources? So to give you an example, should the government put the money, the limited resources that, and not just money as well as the administrative system, the people in government and all of that who have to focus on the work that they do, where do they focus these resources on? Do they focus their resources in creating, for example, a telecommunications company? Or do they focus their resources in maintaining, For example, the irrigation system that we have in the country. Where do those resources go? Right? Or do they put the resources to the education system? Or do they put the resources to the healthcare system? These are the choices that are in front of us because the resources we have are limited. If we had unlimited resources, which unfortunately nobody has, then everyone can do anything. But that is unfortunately not the case. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is the fundamental case for what a lot of people call privatization. I would like to use a different term for this, and I would like to call it unchain. To unchain enterprises, particularly commercial enterprises, from government. Why do I use the term unchain? Because these enterprises have an amazing amount of constraints as long as they are within government. And let me give you an example. Because of the crisis that we are in today, there is a circular that has been sent out, and you all must be aware of this. The circular says that the government cannot hire employees, right? Now think of Sri Lankan Airlines. Sri Lankan Airlines needs pilots. And pilots, unlike us, have to work under very, very specific conditions. They cannot fly for more than a particular period of time. So in their rostering, these are very important factors to take into account. Now, today, Sri Lankan Airlines has a challenge to hire pilots. Why? Because of this circular that has been issued. Now, think of the risk factors associated with not having the right number of pilots or having pilots that are tired who fly planes. Right? Now, if this was a private sector organization, this constraint would not be there. Sri Lankan Airlines needs pilots, they would be hired. But they can't be because of a government circular. Now, when you're in the government sector, because government is so vast, it's not possible, or it's difficult, let me say, to target individually, right? You apply the same thing across the board. And the moment you do that, you're constraining these enterprises, you're chaining them down. So the term I use instead of the word privatization is to unchain. Let me also give you another example. In the private sector, if we want to make a major decision, and I'm talking major decisions, a new factory, for instance, what would we do? We would put up a proposal to the board would approve it, we would go ahead. The approval will come within 2 weeks. You know, it's a question of how quickly can you put the board paper up. You give the board 7 days to 14 days to go through the document, to raise questions, comment, do whatever, it'll get approved. But today, if a government entity needs to make a big investment, it needs board approval. It needs to then go to the secretary of the ministry. The minister needs to take a look at it. And then thereafter, the cabinet needs to approve it. This takes at least 3 months. So where a private sector can do something in 2 weeks, a government institution will take a minimum of 3 months. So the government institution, unfortunately, is chained, and we need to change this. But let me also say that whatever the term you use, unchaining these enterprises from government and taking them into the private sector, whatever term you may use, is only one part of a very broad process that is state-owned enterprise reform. It's only one small part, right? We have to focus on a lot more than just privatizing or unchaining enterprises, because every enterprise cannot be privatized or unchained, cannot be private. The government needs to control certain entities. First and foremost, let me try to explain to you the circumstances under which government needs to control an entity. It's very simple. Remember, I spoke about the essential goods and services. So the first question that one needs to ask, is it an essential good and service that we are talking about? If the answer is yes, then the second question that we need to ask is, in providing citizens these essential goods and services at a good price, at good quality, and with reasonable availability, is there a mechanism that can be used other than government intervention? And if the answer is yes, then government shouldn't intervene. On the other hand, for whatever reason, let's say the private sector is unwilling to participate in the supply of those goods and services, or if other mechanisms like regulatory mechanisms cannot be used to provide the citizens with what they need, then government needs to intervene, and then government needs to be in the supply, needs to take part in the supply of that essential product and or service, right? So government will have control over certain entities. So what we need to do in this whole state-owned enterprise reform program is to figure out a mechanism of how those entities can also be governed. And let me try to paint a picture for you as to why this is important. All of us, until very recently, had access to subsidized fuel, whether it was petrol or diesel or even kerosene, through the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation. Until very recently, until maybe 6 or 7 months ago, right? Every one of us had access, irrespective of what income levels we had. As a result of the subsidy, the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation made some very serious losses. Anyone wants to guess the accumulated loss of the Ceylon Petroleum Corporation as of today? Or as of, I think, end of 2022? Those are the numbers we have. Anyone wants to take a guess? It's okay. Go ahead, take a guess. No? Okay. It's ₹1 trillion, a little more than ₹1 trillion, right? Now, to recover some of these losses, what did the CPC do? The CPC is a monopoly supplier of jet fuel to every airline that flies in and out of Sri Lanka, right? It's a monopoly supplier. It can therefore demand whatever price it wants. And this is what it did. So it charged all these airlines that were flying in and out of Sri Lanka a premium. Now, when I say premium, I'm not talking profit margin. They're entitled to charge a profit margin, but the premium was in relation to the fuel prices in the region, the jet fuel prices in the region. So we were one of the most expensive destinations within our region when it came to jet fuel, right? Now, the thing is that for Sri Lankan Airlines, about 30% of their operating cost is jet fuel, right? So if India was selling, I'm just taking an example, if India was selling jet fuel at say $1 a liter, let's say, we were charging $1.15 or $1.25 or something like this, right? Now, because 30% of Sri Lankan Airlines operating expenditure was jet fuel, this added to their losses, to the losses of Sri Lankan Airlines. Any guesses what the accumulated losses of Sri Lankan Airlines is? Any guesses? Not as high as CPC, I'll give you a hint. It's a little more than 500 billion rupees, right? So CPC, $1 trillion, Sri Lankan Airlines, about a little more than 500 billion. Now, when you make this kind of losses, okay, your operations can't be sustained unless you get money from outside. And as entities, there are two ways in which you can get money from outside. One is you go to your shareholder, which is in this case, the government of Sri Lanka, or you go to the banking system. Now, the government didn't have the funds to provide, so these entities went to the banking system. No commercial bank would extend funding for these enterprises. Why? Because their balance sheets were bad. So what did they do? They go to the state banks. And the state banks give them the money on the basis of a treasury guarantee. So the treasury gives a guarantee to the state bank and says, right, now you lend. Now, you know the country today is in a serious financial crisis, right? We had to go to the IMF. We are restructuring our debts. And what does all of this mean? We are financially challenged as a crisis. Somebody might even say bankrupt as a country, right? In which case, what is the value of that treasury guarantee? Right? In a financially challenged country, what is the value of the treasury guarantee? So now see what has happened, right? A subsidy is given by the CPC. To recover that subsidy, they charge a higher price from Sri Lankan Airlines, as a result of which Sri Lankan Airlines increases their losses. Both of them go to the state banks and borrow money from the state banks, which they can't repay, because they are not generating cash to repay their loan. So you put the entire banking system at risk, particularly the two state banks, right? So can you see how the entire SOE sector has contributed to the financial challenges of this country? So when we talk about state-owned enterprise restructuring, we have to address every one of these issues. So which is why I said this is not just about unchaining some of these enterprises or selling them off or whatever. There is a lot more that needs to be done in terms of managing the enterprises that remain within government. So a couple of things that are required. Okay. Firstly, these subsidies should never be parked within a commercial enterprise. Remember the cycle, CPC, Sri Lankan Airlines, state banks, right? The subsidies should never be parked within these enterprises. These subsidies should be taken into the budget of the government. It should be taken into the government expenditure. So if the government takes a decision that the citizens of the country require subsidy for whatever it may be, and government has every right to make this decision, particularly if it has made a promise in its election manifesto, it has to fulfill its promise. Governments have every right to do this. If they decide that the government shall pass on a subsidy to the citizens, then the government needs to establish a mechanism to ensure that that subsidy comes into the government's budget rather than stays in the enterprise's budget. Because if it stays in the enterprise's budget, what will happen at some point is what happened to all of us. And think what happened to all of us. So we enjoyed subsidized fuel for quite some time, and we all lived happily. But did we ever live happily ever after? No. Why? Because suddenly overnight, the cost of fuel more than tripled. Right? More than tripled for every one of us. And even if we could afford to pay 3 times the price, we couldn't get the fuel. Remember, we had a shortage. So these are the outcomes of not managing the enterprises under government. These are the outcomes when you don't manage an enterprise properly, whether it is government or whether it is private sector. So when you think of it, these are the things that we need to attend to. So one very, very important point is never park a subsidy in a commercial enterprise, number one. And these subsidies are the fundamental cause for the challenge of the SOEs. That's the biggest reason why the SOE sector is not viable. Secondly, and almost equally important, is that we need to appoint proper boards to these enterprises, proper management. We need to have the right boards of directors. We need to have professional boards appointed for these enterprises. People who have the skill, the capacity, and the experience to run these enterprises. You need to know how to manage an entity. Being someone's friend or relation is not a qualification. The qualification is your experience, is the amount of capacity you have, and the skill that you have. So we need to implement a strong system to ensure that these boards, the boards of SOEs, are managed, are filled with the right people, so that if you have a right board, if you have a good board, you can be rest assured that the company will then get managed properly. And it will no longer be a challenge to the country or its economy. And for me, this is the final thing. Whatever we do, whatever our unit does, is focused on making sure that going forward, the SOEs will no longer be a drain on the country's resources, that it will no longer be a challenge for the country, and that the outcome will be positive for the citizens of this country in terms of the citizens getting essential products and services of a decent quality at a decent price and with decent availability. So we are focused on the outcome, and this is the outcome that we are focused on. The benefit of the citizen and it not being a drain on the country and its economy. There are many ways in which we can get there, like the example of the fish. So we are looking at the most efficient way to get there. So it's not the it is complex in a sense, but it is not complex when you think about it. In philosophical terms, it's not very complex. That's what the aim is, and hopefully, given the opportunity, I think we will get to that point. So thank you very much. I will take questions whenever the audience can raise questions. So I look forward to your questions. The subject is complex, and you need a lot of time to explain this, which I don't have too much time to do. But certainly, I will be very happy to take questions from you so that I can clarify any doubts that you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Suresh Shah, for that sharing. And now we'll be going on for the panel discussion. And I will take a moment to introduce our distinguished panelists as we welcome them on stage to join us on stage. We invite Mr. Suresh to join us there. And next we have Dr. Chatura Liyanage. And he is Dr. Liyanage, holding a bachelor's degree in accounting, master's in finance and PhD in microfinance. He also holds professional membership from SEMA UK, SMA Sri Lanka, and Project Management Institute USA. He has over 20 years of experience in academia and industry at various management levels and capacities, including management, consultant, lecturer, and trainer in the fields of insurance, financial services, hotels, and education in Sri Lanka, India, and the UK. At present, he serves as the Director of the Center for Management Research and Director of the Center for Financial Literacy and a Senior Lecturer at the Department of Finance, University of Kelaniya. Dr. Chatura Liyanage, we invite you to please come and join us on stage. Next, we have Mr. Dhananath Fernando. Mr. Fernando is a founding member and the current CEO of Advocata. Previously, he had worked as the Chief Operating Officer since its inception. Prior to founding Advocata, Mr. Fernando worked as an Associate Research Director at Breakthrough Business Intelligence, a leading market research agency in Sri Lanka. He obtained his bachelor's degree in biosciences and biochemistry from the University of Colombo and is an alumnus of the International Vista Leadership Program conducted by the State Department of USA, as well as the alumnus of the Atlas Think Tank Leadership Academy in Washington, D.C. Mr. Dhananath Fernando, please do join us on stage in the panel. Next, we have Mr. Peter de Almeida. Mr. de Almeida is the former Managing Director and Chief Executive of Enable, an IT company he founded in 2008. Before joining the IT industry as a banker, Mr. de Almeida had served as the treasurer of the Ceylon Bank Employees Union, where he actively engaged in championing worker benefits for its employees. While his diverse career spans nearly 3 decades in the banking, advertising, and IT industries, Mr. de Almeida has joined a parallel career in the arts as an actor and a director. He has gained traction as a public speaker with a focus on storytelling, consciousness, and creativity. From a young age, Ms. de Almeida has involved in national social movements and actively engaged in struggles for the defense of human and democratic rights and the protection of the environment. Ms. de Almeida is an alumnus of INSEAD, France. Currently, Ms. De Almeida is Deputy General Secretary of the Ceylon Mercantile Industrial and General Workers Union. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Mr. Peter De Almeida and welcome all our panelists on stage. So to begin with, as we heard Mr. Shah, his keynote address, we will take another few minutes, maybe about approximately 5 minutes for all our resident panelists to have an overview into the discussion. We can start with Dr. Chatrali.
Right, I think, thank you for the opportunity. I think we have come to a very important discussion. I think it's a timely topic. So talking about this restructuring and the privatization, I think this is, even though we are discussing as a buzzword today, this is something that we have been, I would say, experiencing as a country. So especially, I'm little going back to the history. When we are opening up the economy in 1977, we have the government of Sri Lanka was in the verge of privatization, many state-owned organizations. And so therefore, we had a lot of dialogue in that time. And over the years, we have been having this experience in many organizations. So going back to 1997, we have a very, I would say, a key milestone in terms of Sri Lanka Telecom, where we have around 40% share giving to a foreign company in Japan. So therefore, over the years, we have seen many structural changes in terms of many different forms. So it's something that we have been all experiencing. On a global context, we have seen there are many international examples like UK mail, where we see they have seen main structural changes, and also the British Rail and the British Post to be doing a lot of restructuring. And in terms of Singapore, we know that if you take when the Singapore has been as an industrial nation, they came up with this concept of famous act, where they apply this model starting with like a holding company connected to the treasury of the country, and then having organizations running in a more commercial sense rather than involving the government on those operations. So companies like Singapore Airlines, Singtech, which is the Singapore Telecom, is one of those examples where there have been many restructuring and been successfully operating. So if I may sum up with these global and local operations, one of the key things that I see to make this success is the political consciousness. I think that's the word that I want to highlight, where irrespective of the political parties who are running the country, that they are following a one mandate or a kind of a national policy. And on the same time, we see on the other end, the public consciousness also very important, because we need to have the collaboration with people to make this a reality. Now, a good example of SLT, we know that they've given like almost like 3.5% of the shares to the workers of the organization, even though there have been union resistance. The government is able to get the latest technology and the management expertise, which we all witness that we have a major change in the telecommunication industry. So there are plus points as well. And on the same time, we have seen some remarks of not managing properly. For example, there were some estates that in 1970s we have seen, which have been given to some of these private companies, has been completely mismanaged. So therefore, I would say one from a public consciousness and also from a political consciousness, and also the right governance structure. And that's where the key thing that we need to highlight. If we go with a I would say a proper governance structure, I think this can work in the future. So basically, it is nothing new for Sri Lanka. But we need to have the right, I would say, pathway to take it forward.
Thank you, Doctor. Next, we can carry on to Mr. Dhananath. What's your view for the discussion?
First of all, thank you very much for having me. I'm deeply honored and delighted. I will also follow what Suresh's format. If I may ask a question to begin my remarks, how many of you are paying pay taxes? Almost everyone. Excellent. If I were to compare the pay tax collection expectation for 2023 this year by the government is 100 billion. 100 billion. It's easy to remember, 100. As Suresh mentioned, losses of one state-owned enterprise for 8 months is 600 billion. That means if all of you pay taxes for 6 years, it will cover the losses of 8 months of one state-owned enterprise. And I have been tracking the state-owned enterprises since 2016, and I have a list of 527. In my humble view, the Sri Lanka Administrative Office and the government workers have been the most unjustified by managing the state-owned enterprises, because I truly believe that they have been underpaid. They deserve a better salary. Once I met the Treasury Secretary, I was shocked to see his take-home salary, because in the private sector, where people like Mr. De Almeida works on the IT sector, it's not even covering a junior executive salary. The reason is the losses are massive. As I mentioned, 6 years of pay is equivalent to 8 months of one state-owned enterprise's losses, which is mainly affecting the government administrative office. That's just one side. And on the other side, this one institute losses is equivalent to one institute, the entire healthcare and the education budget. I do not think honorable people like you deserve to sacrifice your children's education by not being able to send them to school, by delaying their exams, by not having ink to print the exam papers, by not having funds to correct the exam papers after school, without having money because of the sacrifice that we have to do for loss-making state-owned enterprises. Because there is no winner in this game. As Suresh showed, we all have been losing. Because we have been in queues, everything is completely a mess. I don't think anyone is deserved. And also when you come to a job and an employment, it is not only about the salary. It is also about the job security and the quality of life. That's what we all wanted. So in that sense, I think it's the government sector has been the main on the receiving end or on the disadvantages end because of the losses of these state-owned enterprises. On the other hand, when it was, there are, as Suresh mentioned, there are multiple, and as Dr. Chatur mentioned, there are multiple ways of restructuring. But I think when the private sector is doing well, actually the government is the main beneficiary. Because the government, without doing anything, earns 15% of the income. I'm not talking about the profit as well. And gets 30% from the profit. Now, if Suresh runs the business, if I am given the option of charging 30% without doing anything, I would be very happy. And on top of that, I can also charge 15% from the income. I mean, 15% from the income is a big amount. 15% from anyone's income and 30% of the profit. And even if Suresh make a loss, I have no liability. I don't have to contribute to his losses. I can say I don't know. But if you're making a profit, you give me 30%. If Suresh makes 30%, I can have a better distribution for the government sector where the necessary services has to be supplied, like education, healthcare, and so many other options. So in that sense, I think the government sector has been unfortunately in the massive receiving end or in the disadvantages end because of these state-owned enterprises. And as we all know, it also limits the options, especially when the government sector is running a monopoly. Now, for an example, let's take Petroleum Corporation. If there's an engineer and you know how the boards have been appointed, if a politician is, if you're not in the good books of a politician or if you're going to the bad books, if he starts harassing you, I'm sure in the government sector on promotions and everything, there has been so many discrimination, pretty much you don't have an option. But if you are coming from someone like Ms. Almeida's side, where an IT sector specialist, you have multiple employment opportunities because either you can go for another company or you can go overseas because your employment options are quite diverse. But when someone get trapped into one institute, which is a monopoly, that person really is running out of options. So those are the three sides I see mainly. Additionally to losses, I think we also need to, one thing that we need to compare is the return on assets. For an example, if I run a business with Suresh, his assets are, let's say, 100 rupees. And he makes a profit of 50 rupees by having 100 rupees. I come and say, I make 500 rupees. And I even put a banner saying, look, I'm competing with Suresh, I make 500 rupees. Look at the chairman who has run a public listed company only making 100 rupees. But for me to make 500 rupees, I'm using assets of 1 million. Of course, profits are higher as 500. But Suresh is making 100 rupees by having 500 rupees of assets. I'm making 500 rupees of profit by having 1 million worth of assets. So basically, I'm utilizing quite a lot from the economy just to make 500, while Suresh is only using 100 rupees to make 100 rupees. So in that sense, Suresh is more profitable than what I do because he is using quite a very less number of resources or amount of resources to make that 100 rupees while I'm using millions. So I think we have to keep that also in mind because as we all know, the resources are limited. No one has unlimited amount of money. But in this restructuring process, I must admit, the transparency has to be in the forefront. There's one corrupt deal or one corrupt transaction can completely mess everything up. So that's what we have to be in the transaction process has to be considered. And also the employment of the state sector and the employees in these state-owned enterprises has to be considered. And there are multiple options to do that. It's not only, I think, there's Temasek model, there's Khazana model, there are multiple models which we can evaluate in moving forward. And that would be my initial remarks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fernando. Over to Mr. De Almeida.
Yes, I put my timer on for 5 minutes. Good afternoon, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here to share the stage with such eminent people and to give a different perspective from where I come. Now, firstly, I don't think we have anybody has an issue about restructuring. Restructuring has to happen all the time because the world is changing. There is no special time to do restructuring. So restructuring happens all the time in all our companies, all the time, because there's change. There's technology change, there's social change, environmental change. So every year or every other year, whatever, companies sit down and look at their business and they restructure in some shape or form. There can be radical restructure, there can be minor restructure. So the word restructure is normal. It has to happen. It also has to happen in the private sector. For example, I think our banks have to be restructured, because they are getting away with making billions of rupees of profit with very little to give to developing vital sectors of the economy. So at a time when the people have faced crushing economic depression, the banks have made super profits because they charge a very high rate of interest. That interest, what we call the gap, is 12%. So how can a country come out of a crisis when you have this massive financial institutions that are working against it? So if you're talking about restructuring, let's have a good conversation about what we need to restructure. The banks have to be restructured, and the central bank has a role to play in it. The central bank has to be restructured. Central bank was functioning effectively with all the governors and the perks and privilege. Nobody talks about that. There were people running the central bank who were like cowboys. What did the private sector, anybody do about that? They went and paid obeisance to the central bank governor and worshipping him and praising him and not at all challenging any of the decisions they made that brought us to where we are. So is one part of the problem. But let's look at the big problems. Billions of rupees of foreign reserve were whittled away while this grand central bank was functioning. And they have very little control over the private bank. I have worked supplying solutions to private banks. I worked in a committee of the central bank to introduce technology to reduce open banking. It's a joke. They are not ready to introduce anything new. They want to protect the banking system. We can have a separate conversation how the central bank protects the banks to be non-competitive and to offer very poor services to the people of this country. We'll have a separate discussion with SLIDA on that. So central bank has to be restructured. They enjoy perks and privileges and very little to show. Now, so we all agree. What is the problem we are trying to solve? A country in bankruptcy. It happened only because of the state-owned enterprises. Yes, they paid a contribution. What was the biggest problem? One, they talk about accumulated losses of Sri Lankan, 500 billion over so many years. Within a year, because of an ill-advised tax policy, which the private sector, which is now coming to save the country by restructuring and I don't mean any respect to individuals, don't get me wrong. I'm just talking about the general idea that we are floating, that the private sector somehow are going to be the saviors and miraculously save our country from the mess that we are in. They all took the tax cut. They all took the tax cut. Now they're talking about subsidies. Who subsidized them? Within 1 year, we lost 600 billion rupees because ill-advised tax cut. Now, why didn't this private sector and all the other bodies that now talk about subsidies, say, we don't want the government subsidy at a time like this because this will kill us. They knew that the tax, I mean, they are great economists in the Chamber of Commerce and so on. They never protested. They never said this is ill-advised. They never said this is a subsidy we don't need. They took it. And we lost 600 billion just like that. So, who is going to do this restructuring? The people who took the money and the private sector that led to this fall, one of the main reasons for the fall, are going to do this. So, my 5 minutes is up. So, I'll just take one moment. When the future rounds, I can talk about it. Now, talking about, the country, the biggest problem that the country faces is corruption. I mean, wonderful gentlemen like Suresh Shah, and I've known them for a long time. They're decent people. They really want, he has nothing better to do than to come and work in this. He doesn't get paid to do this. But why does he do it? Because he genuinely believes, and he had a very fine presentation, and I respect that. Genuinely believes we can do something. But can he? When you have a corrupt government and a practice in place, that has to be restructured. That's why we had the Aragale and said system change. Restructure, system change. You have this rotten system, and people like Mr. Shah will be money and energy. They are proposing, for example, a board. Who appoints the board? So if you don't address the question of corruption, systemic corruption, and I must say, the private sector contributes towards this. Who pays the government money for corruption? Who? The government gives money to the government to corrupt? No. Private sector, no. So, private sector encourages corruption. I have not seen very many statements from many chambers and so on. I searched for it today. You see, none of them have spoken about it. And when you have this same government that has brought this country to ruin in power, they are going to implement these structural changes without any benefit to them. It's a dream, no? It's a dream. It's a myth. So, my submission is, Suresh, Mr. Shah might have very good intention. I like the way he framed the issues. He framed it in a very interesting way. But the fact is that it will be nothing but a way to sell our assets to the private companies. And this will include strategic assets. We'll talk about that in a minute. And it will end up with nothing in our hands, no assets to rebuild the country. And there will be a bunch of private companies under a corrupt regime who will get paid off for carving out and selling these, and we'll have very little to show, particularly at a time of crisis. Top economists like Yanis Varoufakis and others have said, do not sell your assets at a time of a crisis because you will have to sell it at a fire sale price. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Yameda. So that sets the stage for the discussion, I guess, and we can start with Mr. Suresh Shah. The first question we have for you is, what is the government's approach, our strategy in restructuring SOEs, going for the large loss-making ones or easiest ones at first? Any roadmap prepared?
Thank you. So I just need to respond to Peter's comment on the tax, on the reduction of the taxes in 2019. The Ceylon Chamber, of which I'm a part of, been an office bearer of it for many years, we did make representations telling the government that this was not the right thing to do. So I think we need to be very clear on that. The Ceylon Chamber, not just the Ceylon Chamber, I believe quite a few of the other chambers as well, expressed the view that the tax reductions of the time was not in the interest of the country. So I want to get that cleared and out of the table. In terms of the roadmap that you're speaking of, there is a SOE policy document that was prepared. It was presented to Cabinet, and the Cabinet approved it on the 15th of May. That clearly lays out what needs to be done with the SOE sector. It's based around 9 principles. One of those principles, for example, is what I spoke about, that subsidies should not be parked within a enterprise. Another one of the principles is that we need to move away. We need to move the SOEs out of getting funding from the state banks through treasury guarantees. Of course, you can't do this overnight. You have to have a period of time over which we can do that. So like this, we set up the policy on around 9 principles. And of course, again, one of the principles is also what kind of enterprise will government retain. And again, I tried to outline when I spoke a little earlier, the criteria under which government will retain institutions. So for example, if the private sector is not willing to play a part in the supply of essential goods and services, then the government has a responsibility, and so on and so forth. So we've covered all of these aspects in the policy. Dhananath spoke about, I think it was Dhananath who spoke about Temasek and Khazana. There is the holding company concept has been brought into play. So we have recommended the holding company concept. And the way and Peter, I think, very correctly spoke about how boards are appointed. We put in a mechanism to appoint the board, not just of the holding company, but also of SOEs thereafter, taking into account some of the issues that he raised, which I believe are very valid. So like this, we've looked at the challenges that the SOE sector has faced over the last 75 years. Since our independence, we've identified what the key challenges were. And we have then tried to put in mechanisms to make sure that, that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past and that we go forward. So, like I summarized, the policy revolves around, on the one hand, the provision of essential goods and services to the citizens of the country at a good price, of good quality and good accessibility. whilst it should not be a burden on the finances of the government.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Mr. Next, it's for Dr. Lianage. And if you can just take us back to the history of SOE restructuring, how it has been in the past, and the success or the failures in this local context within Sri Lanka and in the global aspect, what we may have to get from the past, and also the reasons for those results. If you can brief us through that.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the global context, this is, again, like I said, it's nothing new. It has been happening throughout the world. From a global perspective, I've seen Latin American countries have more SOE restructuring than the Asian countries, and they have been funding a lot from those countries compared to Asian countries. But on the same side, if we look at, I've seen in an international arena, they have trying to calculate kind of an index of the level, or the, I would say, the giving a score of how this process has to happen, and what is the level of good practice that they follow. And we have seen in countries like Australia, US, and especially the European countries, they have been having a good governance and have a good score in terms of this process. However, again, in some of the Asian countries, we have a low score where the right governance is not happening. Now, especially countries I've seen, India, especially the Indonesian. Indonesia has been a little less than Malaysia and China. However, that score is also important. I think that's where we connect, even Mr. Peter was highlighting the governance, the good governance. I think that is the most critical component out of all this essence of this discussion, because if there's no proper governance, this will not be success. And if we have the right governance, yes, it will be success. So all this success and the failure will depending on this governance point. So even in the past, like I highlighted at the beginning, if we go back to our privatization process when we are opening up the economy, again there were some operations were much governed by a proper process, which we have seen the results over the years. But I take the example of the same telecom example. But again, we've seen some of the situations where the proper process has not been happened, it has not been followed, and then there was no, the transactions had done through arm's length, so it has been given to your own relatives and friends. As a result, even though there's been a privatization, but there's no proper governance. As a result, things has been failed over the period, and the expected results have not been achieved. So therefore, so this whole success and the failure comes from this governance process. So that's why I think it's very important to have a clear mechanism. Now, if you take an example, like Mr. Peter was highlighting, if you take most of these SOEs are coming under one set ministries. So when you talk about these ministries, we know that, okay, these positions are given from the political connectivity. So there will be unqualified people who will be coming to these boards, and then they are taking decisions just to short-sighted decisions, and some of the decisions are not profitable, and just to win elections, just to make the ruling party happy, they've been having those decisions. So as a result, there's no strategic vision, there's no future, so they take only short-term decisions. So that, as a result, we have seen, even though we have been doing certain privatizations, it has not been happening properly. So one of the main things I see, if we are to get this governance structure, I personally believe that we need to have these SOEs independently out of this political framework, so that they can operate properly. I think the presenters were highlighting the Singaporean framework, and the Malaysian framework will really work if we can really do it. So, but all that will depend again, what's the level of the framework that we can do it in-house. So people have concerns again, I would like to see the political consciousness is very important, because if we set the policy and then after a couple of years down the line another ruling party comes and change the whole policy, Of course, even though we start with a good intention, over the period it will not be there, because then some of the legal issues will come, and then they will take back some of the assets. So there will be many clashes after that. So that long-term roadmap will not be achieved. So therefore, whoever has to come to the power with this good governance, there should be a kind of a one policy to be followed. So that is, I would say, the key for the success.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yanage. Moving on to Mr. Ranath Fernando. The question we have for you is, what are the benefits and risks of SOE restructuring? Will it lead towards market liberalization and improving efficiencies in the long run?
Thank you very much. I will start with the risk. I think the biggest risk that we have is replacing a government monopoly by a private monopoly. That's the biggest risk, because if you already have one company which is mainly run by the government, and when you sell it to another private company, monopoly is very bad. Even it could be government, it could be private, it's bad. And we experience how bad monopolies are, because if you have a monopoly, that's a massive threat for national security and everything, because you only have one option. Because if that person having a difficulty, like what we experienced on our petroleum products and electricity, because that was the only supplier, and when they face a problem, it could be a natural disaster, it could be a man-made crisis, everything would be a problem. And also our past track record on privatization is also not good. That challenge is there. So that's the risk of setting up the bad example. That's the risk side. And also the other risk is getting, as I think Dr. Chatur touched upon that, but getting the consensus among multiple stakeholders will not be easy. But the benefit side would be, definitely, I think already the employees on those state-owned enterprises will be the biggest beneficiary. Because even if you look at the telecom privatization, the engineers who are there, their income increased, because when you have a competitive environment, they will be paid more. Now, for an example, if a petroleum company enters Sri Lankan market, they are not going to bring people from India or China. That has to be the same people who are from this market. So when you have a competitive environment, of course, you have more options. You can demand for a higher salary, so their income should increase. That's the benefit side. And also the efficiency has to go up, because when you are in a competitive environment, of course, to make a profit, you have to be efficient and productive. So those are the main benefits and the risk factors I see. I will also address what Mr. De Almeida pointed out in his initial remarks. Of course, the private sector is no saint, because if you look at most of the protectionism happen in this country, and most of the instances where the competition has been limiting is by the private sector. So what we need is not just a privatization or a restructuring. That's what we as Advocata, we always advocate, set up the competitive framework, because market works when there's competition. Competition cannot be managed through a monopoly. Competition cannot be managed through an oligopoly. There has to be a competitive framework, and that's the only way that can come out. I will give you one good example to wrap up my remarks. If you recall, when I was a school kid, I didn't, of course, didn't have a mobile phone. Only the ministers had that mobile phone. Of course, they had an assistance to carry the phone, because it was so big. You call exactly like a gadol bag to carry that. And if you recall, for an incoming call, they charged about 22 rupees. And they had a facility called CLI facility. Just to appear the number from the receiving end, they charged, I think, about 2 rupees. Now with 100% inflation, everything, are you going to pay 22 rupees for an incoming call? Today, you will ask, like, what on earth you're talking about? With all that, things drastically dropped, the rate dropped. And on the telecommunication front, I think we were one of the countries to launch first the 5G technology a few years ago, but it couldn't happen, I think, for multiple reasons. But when there's a competitive environment, the rates dropped, the prices dropped, and the service became better. I'm sure when I was a schoolboy, we didn't have a telephone line. I used to give my school friends the number of the neighborhood, and they call me, and they come and running to my house and say there will be a call from after 10 minutes time. I used to run to their house and then take the call. But now I think if you are saying you are waiting in a line for like even 2 weeks to take a telephone line, that's unacceptable. You just walk in, get the phone, and when you are coming out, you have the connection. Efficiency improve, service levels improve, everything improve. But it only happened on a competitive environment. There were multiple players entered the market. There was a competitive environment. It was not just the private sector entrance. It's a competitive environment. And I strongly believe there has to be a competitive regulatory framework that needs to coming in. Even if we need to have like, price distortions, and there can be some market manipulations by the private sector. So that competitive commission or a competitive framework is a must to succeed, to get the maximum benefits for the people. And that will also save a lot of money for the government, that can benefit the government sector and the state sector as well.
Thank you, Mr. Fernando. Mr. Peter D. Almeida, the question we have for you is, what is the perception of trade unions, both in private and public sectors, on the restructuring of the SOEs?
So as a trade union itself, we have not really sat down and spoken about it in any great detail. But in the CMU, we have had some conversations about this whole question of what is needed for the country right now. So I think our general opinion is that there are strategic assets that we have to own. See, when you're in a crisis, when you're in a bankruptcy, you have to deploy assets, no? Common sense, ne? You have to deploy assets to come out of it. Now, if you give away those assets that can be used very cleverly, smartly, if you just give it away. Now, for example, take power. Now, power has to be subsidized. Now, the countries that are doing well, according to Dr. Harvard Nicholas, I heard his talk on Face the Nation the other day. He made a very interesting point. He said in the East Asian countries, power is subsidized. As a result, companies from Europe, where power is very expensive, are coming to East Asia, to Vietnam and all these places, to set up their factory. He said BASF, one of the big companies in Germany, is moving to Vietnam or into one of the East Asian countries because they are subsidizing power. So you can make a loss, but it's a strategic loss that you make. Now, we don't know the report that Mr. Shah and his team of people have submitted. So how can we discuss this? I think the right thing to have done would have been, since they're all members of the private, largely the private sector, they should have said, if we are getting interested, if we are getting involved in this, our report must be up for public discussion, Shah. I'm saying, given the context of the country and the suspicion we have of this government, of any government, when it comes to restructuring equals privatization, we are very suspicious. So I think given what we went through, the crisis and all that challenge, they should have said transparency. Our report will be held up for public discussion. Now, if we had that report, we could have been sure that they are not talking about breaking things up and selling it to the lowest bidder. But we don't know that. But the strategic assets, management of strategic assets, is so important. So the first and foremost, any committee should have members of the public who are the public interest. I went through the name, Shah. Almost all, firstly, thank you for clarifying that point about the chamber. It was not publicly known, so I just went by. So thank you for that correction. I see all of them are private sector folks in that committee, restructuring committee. So that can't be the case, no. I mean, we have some top public sector people who have the interest of the public at heart, not profit, and there can be conflicting interests also among some of the people there, but they are in the private sector. Some of them will be involved in not deals, businesses that will vie for these companies. It's a conflict, you know. So you must have public servants, eminent public servants, economists, who must serve in that committee. Why is there no one? Why is that? So you see, it's already skewed. Naturally, we are suspicious. So if you're going to give away your assets, now take some of the things we did. We privatized the NDB and the DFCC. It's a criminal mistake. Now who is going to provide cheap funds? The private banks are going to provide cheap funds to restructure the country. So why has that not been addressed? If you're restructuring, you must say, let's look at the financial institutions. What's the role you're playing in helping? You're going to keep a spread of 12% spread between lending and borrowing rates. How is that? So get to the basics. Now you want to, and what is the first company we're talking about? Telecom. Telecom is doing well. What they and telecom infrastructure for the future with AI, automation, learning, online learning in schools, absolute prerequisite for to build a future of the 2030s, 2035. That can't be just given to the private sector. So if the public sector is doing something, then the private sector will also try to play a role. You have to subsidize telecom infrastructure for schools and so on. Who's going to do that? So I don't know whether this committee did a study of that kind of strategic assets, how they must be protected, and so on and so forth, so that we get an understanding. Now, take in Germany, now this point that Dr. Lienege made, the Daily Telegraph in UK, that was always for privatization, have now come out and said, some of the sales we did are a blunder. Airports, they gave the airports to the private sector. Monopoly, disaster, disaster. Now they're trying to buy it back. In Germany, they bought a company, German government, they bought back a company called Hypo Real Estate, 5 minutes up. Hypo Real Estate company, financing in real estate. They seized the company in 2007-2010 crisis, seized it by force because they want to stabilize the financial market. That means some of our banks have to be seized to stabilize. I'm not advocating it. I'm saying so. The government must have in its control key assets. So what are you going to do if you just break it up and sell it? Like I said, energy and all of that. Take healthcare. Take healthcare. What is the status of healthcare? And I want to disagree with you respectfully, Dharna. You say private sector gives money. Not true. Not true. Because you go to, I am now working in the trade unions. You know, workers are paid 20,000 basic salary starting. Restructure that. 20,000 basic salary. With inflation at 70%, the real wage, if you do the calculation of a 20,000 salary today, is 6,000 rupees. Now I come to your point. They go to the government for education, medicine. Private sector doesn't. Government is subsidizing them. Where does the government private sector provide healthcare? Such level of healthcare. Most of the companies I went to and had gone to about 20 of them in the last 3 months. No healthcare. Government subsidized. And you can work it out, Diana. And it's a good challenge for you to work out. What is the subsidy the government provides to the private sector companies to keep their employees living? Living. They'll die. So, the private sector is not doing much to help the government pull yourself out of a mess like this, and our people's livelihoods are destroyed. Why can't the private sector say minimum wage 30,000? Why are they not saying that? Restructure so that the lives of the people are protected. That's our perspective from the trade union.
Thank you, Mr. Almeida. We move on to Mr. Shah, and now it's about the strategic reason to retain specific entities. That is, if there are any entities that are going to be held by the state. If there are, why would that be? And what the reasons are for those holding back those entities?
Yeah, so like I said earlier, in the event that these entities are providing an essential product or service, and government has no other mechanism to provide that essential goods or service to the citizens, then the government needs to be involved in the provision of those services, right? So that would be one. Secondly, if there is, let's say, a national security issue where the government needs to be in control, then I think the entity needs to be within the control of government. Thirdly, if there is a development need, and I will try to explain this with an example. So if you go back to the 1950s, and as a country, if we were trying to develop tourism, and the airline was necessary for the development of tourism of the country, and if the private sector was not willing to set up an airline because of the costs associated, and you know, Sri Lanka was a poor country at the time, so on and so forth. So the public sector may not have been inclined to invest in an airline. Then to develop tourism, government may have taken a call in the 1950s to say, okay, we are going to set up an airline, and that was called Air Ceylon. Today, circumstances have changed. right? There are many airlines that fly into the country. You don't need to own an airline to promote tourism for Sri Lanka, and so on and so forth. So circumstances change, and then you take a call accordingly. So fundamentally, if there is a development need, again, government may want to remain in a particular enterprise. So those would be the reasons why government would want to retain an enterprise under its control. I want to address a couple of very important issues that were raised. One was on the whole issue of transparency on transactions. And I want to assure everyone that the process is extremely transparent in this sense. Now, we won't just sell assets. First and foremost, there will be transaction advisors who will be appointed for these companies. So Sri Lankan Airlines, there will be a transaction advisor appointed. In the case of some of the entities, the transaction advisor is appointed is the International Finance Corporation, which is a World Bank group company, and Sri Lanka is a shareholder of the World Bank. And in some of the other enterprises, there will be private sector transaction advisors that come in, but there is a process of selecting the private sector transaction advisors. So we advertise in both the local and the international press. We get them to respond for expressions of interest and also for RFPs, requests for proposals. Then the evaluation is done not by our unit, but there is a separate cabinet appointed procurement committee that will evaluate all the EOIs and the RFPs. And then they will look at also the financial proposals, and that's how the transaction advisors get appointed. The same process is followed even when investors are, when we speak to investors. So there will be public announcements through the press, both in Sri Lanka and overseas, so that any investor who is interested in looking at any of these assets, they will have an opportunity to provide a proposal through a EOI and RFP process. Again, there will be a cabinet appointed procurement committee, not us, that will go through the proposals received. They will do the evaluations and they will do the shortlistings and so on and so forth. And they will look at valuations and so on and so forth. So the process is very transparent. So in terms of valuations, whilst the transaction advisors will help with the valuations, they'll finally be signed off by the government chief valuer. So there are checks and balances in the whole system. So that I want to assure everyone that the process that we follow will be very transparent and completely above board. That's number one. I think Dhananath raised an extremely important question of the monopoly situations. That government monopolies should not be moved into private sector monopolies, and that's an extremely important principle. Now, there may be instances for a very short period of time where, in order to privatize some of these enterprises, you may need to retain the monopoly status or the leading market share status, but for a while. And in the event we are compelled to do that, there will be sunset clauses with the investor to say that those statuses will move out within a very short period of time. And one of the ways of doing that was, I think there was an example of that recently when government liberalized the fuel retailing sector. Previously, it was only Ceylon Petroleum Corporation and LIOC. Now there are 3 others coming into the sector. So those are some of the mechanisms that will be used to make sure that government monopolies are not turned into private sector monopolies. And I think Dhananath also raised the issue about regulation. I think, again, a very, very important point, which, again, we are focusing on. So an example is that in the supply of gas, there are no regulators, right? We need to set up that regulatory framework in the supply of LPG. The telecom regulations, I think, need to be modernized. The insurance regulations. And so we will look at all of these things as well. So that again is, I think, an important issue that was raised. We are very conscious of all of this, and yes, we will look at these things as well. As for Peter's point about, yes, there are not all, it's not exclusively private sector. There is a member from the public service who is part of our committee, but very importantly, our committee is set up under the Ministry of Finance, right? And that is overlooked by the ST. There are DST, so we fundamentally report to the public service, and everything we do at the end of the day has to go through cabinet. So there is that process that is followed. Yeah, sorry, you asked me the question, which
yes, that's okay. That is the purpose of this, the discussion, right, where everything can be brought up to one platform. That's fine. If I may go on to Dr. Lianage, what is the difference between the restructuring and privatization of an SOE? If we can just get an idea, because there are concerns about what everybody tend to have. I think it was being discussed as well. I'll just combine that with what are the expected outcomes of the SOE restructuring that
I think so I think we have already been presented by many presenters about the main expected outcomes that we are looking for. Mainly, we know that with the current context of the crisis, we need a solution in terms of some crown jewels to be sold to manage the whole situation. That's the one area that we are looking for. But on the other hand, personally, I believe if we can come up with a good governance structure with this whole process, which we have been lacking all these years, even like Mr. Diana was highlighting, the public sector servants to work in that right framework, that would help a major burden to the economy. For example, they can take the decisions in a more independent manner, where they don't, no more politicalization will happen. And so therefore, if they can actually have that transparency, where the decisions can be taken more commercial aspect, and that will help the organizations to perform, which will have in the long term, we see that there will be less losses, or we can have more profits, and on top of that we can have the direct tax income to the economy. So from a government perspective, their biggest concern is these loss-making companies, and as a result, the main expenses like the government expenditure is too high, and the main expenses, rather than we are paying for education and for the health sector, we have been just pumping money to facilitate these loss-making companies. So it's something we have a bigger elephant to clear. So if we can actually sort that part, we can easily see some good economic reforms, which will help the country to move forward. So in the long run, I believe if we can have that right structure, yes, we will have many benefits. On top of that, one thing personally, I have this concern now when it comes to some of these organizations, their performance has been really bad and really inefficient. So sometimes is it the right time for us to sell the business? Because if we are putting into the table whether there will be an investor would like to make that at a loss, or whether there will be so many inefficiencies. So therefore, even to get a good price, we may have to work out. So personally, I think sometimes we may have to do some initial restructuring. I would like to ask that also from Mr. Shah, because we may have to do some initial restructuring at least to get a good price from the investor, because with the current scenario in some of the organizations, we don't know whether we will even have a good price to even receive. So, but if we are to actually initially to do some restructuring, and if we can make some progress on that, I think in the long run we will have more bids to come, and where we will have a more negotiation with the even foreign investors to get a good price, which will be at the end of the day will have a better price to the government. So, yes, we all believe that if we can do with the right governance, I'm sure there will be many benefits to the economy in terms of reducing our expenditures, and on the same time we can see some little impact of our balance of payment, and also to minimize these essential item shortages. I think that will have many positive impacts to the economy in the long run.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lianage. Over to Mr. Damanath Fernando. Next, what are the different kinds of restructuring procedures applicable in Sri Lanka in the context? And is there a potential for acquisition and merging of SOEs?
Absolutely. There are multiple options. I think we spoke about it earlier as well. One option is, as Suresh mentioned, this holding company, either a Temasek model or a Khazana model, where the government works as a holding company and an investment fund. And in Singapore, according to, I heard Lee Kuan Yew's exact words, this Temasek model was set for government to leave from businesses and run it as a professional organization. And that's the objective of the Temasek model. But having said that, let me warn you, even with such a good structure in Singapore, Singaporean Prime Minister's wife was appointed as a CEO in the Temasek model. Of course, I think luckily they were not interfering, but I think we had to be very careful. That's why I was insisting on the governance structure. And on that, I agree completely with Mr. De Almeida. The corruption and the governance structures has to be there, because we can bring the best economic policy in the world, but if it's on a corrupted environment, it would be difficult. But having said that, we also can't wait till the uncorrupted DSN Kumara arrives to get these reforms done, because we are hitting against the wall. We are running against the clock. So that has to happen. So one option is the Temasek model. I think there are certain industries that we have to unbundle. Now I'll give you a classic example on public transport. On transportation, I don't think anyone here would be satisfied with our train service or the public transportation service. Now the train service, if you go to Japan, I'm sure most of you have been there for the training programs, various training programs under the government. The Japanese trains are one of the on-time train services, best public transportation ever. Perfectly run by a public company. Perfectly run by a private sector company. Where not only they own the trains, they also own the lands adjacent to that, where even the restaurants and the apartments, everything is run under them. As a result, now if you look at our train stretch, which I come from Moratuwa to Colombo, I mean, that's a wonderful stretch. You are facing towards the beach, and it's a very enjoyable journey if the trains are not crowded. Otherwise, you have to come like we call it in Sinhala, train if that was not possible. But the thing is, that land stretch, if you look at the real estate value, that's one of the highest real estate value lands in that stretch. Of course, if you give it to a real estate developer, of course that the train service will be complementary to the land value, and for restaurants and so many other facilities that the investment would joining in. So that's the model that Japan followed, but it's completely the other way around. So I think for that we have to unbundle, because the track can be, okay, the ownership of the track can be kept by the government, but the train timetable, the compartments can be open for private sector. If you recall, there was a Expo Lanka and a Rajdhani Express train compartment, which was very conveniently running to Kandy and back and forth. But unfortunately, it was not continued, where the government also got a benefit. So there are multiple models, as I said, but I would also like to address some of the points that Mr. De Almeida made. I think what Peter made. I have a slightly different view on the subsidies issue. I will give you a classic example, just for the example point of view. Now, Suresh, let's say, imagine Suresh drives a Mercedes-Benz. No offense to you, Suresh. So we know on a Mercedes-Benz, the fuel efficiency is quite low. Probably if Suresh drives a Mercedes-Benz, for 1 liter, he can run about 5 kilometers. So imagine the government gives a fuel subsidy of 10 rupees for each liter. So that means for Suresh to run 5 kilometers on his Mercedes-Benz, the government gives 50 rupees of subsidy for his 5 kilometers. Where I run a motorbike, which my motorbike runs 20 kilometers from 1 liter. So the government gives also a subsidy for me for 1 liter, for which I get 1/5 of the subsidy that Suresh gets. So by giving a subsidy, you're allowing Suresh, you're incentivizing Suresh to consume more of the government funds, because he is consuming most of the government subsidy because his car is more inefficient in fuel. And of course, someone like Suresh can afford to pay a higher price. So what needs to be done? Now the other side is, if we remove the fuel subsidy, that also have an impact on me, because even the 1/5 of what Suresh gets, I won't get it. So what needs to be done is, that's why we have been advocating these policies has to be cannot be looked at only on the state-owned enterprises reform. That's one important. There has to be a social safety net. So when Suresh and me both paying the same price, I should ideally get a social safety net benefit to replace what I'm compromising. Because that way the government funds can be better utilized, because you can charge Suresh the market price, they're charging me the market price, but I get an extra benefit for the sacrifice that I made. So that way it's good for environment, good for the government, good for the business. So that's why I'm not very keen on giving subsidies for everyone, but it has to be backed up with a social safety net. On the other point, on the electricity prices, the same thing happened. I think, in my view, I have a different view. Most of the companies are moving to East Asia, not because of the electricity prices. It is because of their efficiency levels and the low regulatory barriers. Look at what's happening in Thailand. Look at what's happening in Vietnam. They're very competitive. In Sri Lanka, for you to open a company, you have to go to, I mean, it's impossible. It's simple as that. It's impossible. But that's one reason the Apple and Samsung and everyone is moving to Korea, to Thailand, even to India, where the electricity prices are very competitive. So, and also on the telecommunication matter, I think one reason telco is making profits is because they were privatized. Otherwise, I probably would have still run to the neighborhood to get that call. But of course, I'm not saying, I mean, the government there can be management contracts. The director board can be appointed from the private sector, and that will be more accountable, transparent. Again, I don't think we can privatize or restructure all 527. There has to be key ones, because it's so diverse. Even if you restructure one at a day, still it takes about 2 years to restructure all state-owned enterprises. So I think there are key ones in the sense the massively loss-making ones that we have to restructure. But there are multiple options to do that. But the focus has to be having that competitive environment. But of course, you can't look at this entire economic reform process single-handedly on looking at only the state-owned enterprises reforms. As Peter correctly said, and I agree with him, that there has to be social safety net comes into play. There has to be a lot of deregulation needs to be done. Opening a business is, as I mentioned, impossible. There has to be so many other changes has to happen in the entire economy for us to be successful. Just this can't be done. But having said that, we also can't wait till everything becomes perfect, because nothing is perfect and we have to start from somewhere. And that one key priority areas is state-owned enterprises reforms.
Thank you, Mr. Fernando. Mr. Peter, how could it be ensured that the restructuring process is fair and transparent for all stakeholders?
Firstly, as I said, the composition of the committee, I have a lot of issues with that. Nice people, I know them, a lot of them personally, but that does not, can that be representative of some of the challenges we are trying to address? I don't think so. They're all nice people, but I don't think collectively they have the capacity to look at national issues like this. Largely private sector, whatever said and done, they are only interested in profit, largely, almost entirely. They do not look at the public interest. Tell me one private sector company that looks at public interest. Tell me one. Tell me one. Not one. So they will always subject the public interest for their profit interest. So how can we form a committee that is essentially good people, but their background is in private sector? So they come from that background. You need that also in the committee. But you need other people who understand public infrastructure, public services. What does that mean? What does that mean? Agriculture, critical assets of the country. So there are other people. So it's not representative. No women. How come there are no women? Not a single woman in the, why no women are capable of, so it's a boys' club. So what's the point? So straight away, the composition in today's day and age, not a single woman, not token. Surely we can say, I say, what kind of committee is this? Let's find some good women. In public sector, there are fantastic women public servants. Why are they not there? Finally, transparent. You must put this up for discussion. No? If I was asked to serve in a committee appointed by this Ministry of Finance, sorry, Suresh, I have very little respect for the Ministry of Finance and the Treasury. They ruined this country, no, Suresh. How can you have faith in these same scoundrels? I mean, come on. And you report to them. Why should you put yourself through this ignominy of having to report to them? They should be out. And then the process. Cabinet appointed procurement committee. Where are we going? What is this restructure? Back to square one. So good people wasting their good talent and resources, you send it working under this treasury, which is completely serves the interests of the government in power, not as an independent treasury finance ministry, and the process is not known to the public. So you should have said, we are not serving on this committee unless we present this as a white paper for discussion and comments by others, civil society. I mean, I don't like the word civil, other organizations. So that process is completely dead from the start. Whose interest does it serve? And cabinet, who are these transaction advisors? Now we have done lots of public. Where are these people who would have advised them? You can't even find them now. They would have advised the government. Who are these people? How are they selected? You know, so a lot of issues. And finally, you are leaving it to this cabinet, which has lost its mandate, which has no business to be in power. No business to be in power. That's postponing local government elections. That's not represent the will of the people. You serve as a committee for restructuring our assets under this setup. Huge problem about transparency and about getting the job done. Chatura, you said good governance. That's wishful thinking, no? You say, if you have good governance, that's like, you know, saying we can solve all the problems. That is the problem. And that's why I'm worried that this is nothing but using people like Suresh and others who are well-intentioned people, using them to get their dirty work done, which is nothing but, mark my words, we'll come back here in 3 years, we'll talk about what happened today, mark it in your calendar, we'll come back, and I can tell you this, it'll be nothing but using a false mechanism, give it some respectability, end up selling your assets, very little, no or very little benefit to the people of this country to rebuild the country. Rebuild the country. I'll take 1 minute. There's a Houseman report, Harvard School. They said the critical need for Sri Lanka is foreign direct investment, export diversification. None of those will be addressed by this process. We can't save the country just by saving the money that we are going to take out of these companies. We cannot work the numbers. We need export diversification. Houseman report, Harvard, 2016, when Ranil was in power, minister. So they have not identified this as a critical binding constraint. One of the things is policy inconsistency. And this government will continue to have policy inconsistency. All the good work will be wasted.
Back to Mr. Suresh, you can always, counteract or give your opinion or his thoughts as well. So we are coming towards the latter part of the session, but I'll just combine a few questions and concerns, but they need clarification from. So what are the obstacles, challenges expected during the restructuring? How to maintain the financially stability of those SOEs during the restructuring process? And also how the potential impacts on size and scale of the operation in the transformation could be managed?
The obstacles are fundamentally a lack of knowledge across society, unfortunately. And just to respond to Peter's point of the committee not having females, we actually do have 2, and very respectable ones as well. So,
sorry, I'm reading some other. I have 5 names. I'm sorry. I checked it today.
Peter, I hope the other information that you gave the audience is more accurate than that.
Challenge me. I'm always ready to be corrected. So please go ahead.
Yeah. So a couple of points. There was this discussion about, say, Sri Lanka Telecom, for example, and the kind of potential or the kind of investments that it needs to make in things like artificial intelligence and all of, and these new technologies that are emerging. So a very fundamental question: how many of these new technologies were actually invented by governments? Was artificial intelligence invented by a government? No. These are all private sector inventions at the end of the day, right? And let's leave even that aside for a moment, and let's think of Sri Lanka Telecom. Sri Lanka Telecom is in an extremely competitive environment. Recently, you must have heard that Dialog and Airtel are trying to merge, which makes the environment even more competitive. It's an entity that requires an incredible amount of investment if it is to reach its full potential. It needs to invest, like was discussed here, in new technology and so on and so forth. And so just think about it. If you have a financially challenged major shareholder of an entity that needs to expand, and that shareholder needs to put money into the enterprise, how does this enterprise actually expand? Where will that funding come from? One of the most important aspects for a growing organization, for an expanding organization, for an organization that needs to compete, is to have shareholders who have the financial capability to invest when it's required, the sector knowledge and financial capability to invest. So that this is a, so the term that I used, unchain from government, is because you need to take these enterprises out of the limiting factors that government unfortunately imposes on these organizations, right? So that's one. Another major fallacy that we come across is this whole story about loss-making enterprises and profit-making enterprises, right? Now, the thing is, today's profit-making enterprise can be tomorrow's loss-making enterprise, and today's loss-making enterprise can be tomorrow's profit-making enterprise. So if assets get so, and leave public sector and private sector out of this, if assets get sold just because of profit and loss, right, whether they're profit-making or loss-making, nothing will ever get sold, because who will want to buy a loss-making asset and who will want to sell a profit-making asset if that's the only reason? Assets are sold for strategic reasons. Not because they make losses and because they make profits. Companies in the private sector do buy loss-making enterprises, and companies do sell profit-making enterprises. So fundamentally, what drives them is strategy, not whether they make money or whether they lose money. That's number two. Number three, let's even just think of it only in terms of rupees and cents, right? Now, we are talking about an entity that over the last 10 years has declared dividends. Oh, by the way, one very important, very fundamental issue: the profits of an enterprise don't belong to the shareholder. The profits of an enterprise belong to the enterprise. What goes to the shareholder is only the dividends that gets declared by the directors, right? So if you think of an enterprise that over the last 10 years has declared on average a dividends, which then contributes to the government a dividend of 1.5 billion a year, right, over the last 10 years. This same enterprise is today valued on the stock exchange at roughly at about 150 billion rupees, okay? Government share of this is about 75 billion rupees. Now, if we are just talking only cash flow, right? If the government sells this entity for 75 billion rupees and takes that 75 billion and puts it in a fixed deposit at 10%, it will make 7.5 billion every year, as against the profit, as against a dividend it gets of 1.5 billion, right? 5 times more. So even if we are looking at this purely from a cash flow perspective, there is no argument. But there is a much more fundamental reason why governments should not be focused on profit. And let me try to explain this. If we, as a society, tell government everything you do must be profitable, there is going to be a huge challenge when it comes to law enforcement. Okay? Think about this. You go to the police station and make an entry, right? Do the police charge you? They don't. because that is a public service obligation of government. It's not supposed to make profit. But if you insist that government makes profit on everything, the next time you go to the police station to make an entry, they will tell you, please pay us 500 rupees or 1,000 rupees or 2,000 rupees. Every time you go to a hospital, they will charge you money for it because they will say, look, you're telling us to make profit, right? So in which case you pay for it. Okay, so it is extremely dangerous. Think national security, right? And you focus government on this whole profit thing, on the whole profit motive. How will a government fund a security force, an army, a navy, a police, air force? How do they do that? So focusing government on this story of profit is extremely dangerous. Profit is the purview of the private sector. But yes, government does need revenue to meet its obligations and its responsibilities. And there is a very specific mechanism that has been developed for government to get the revenue that it needs, and that is called the taxation system. And government has a lot of power and flexibility over the taxation system, as we've all seen. You know, until very recently, I think our maximum rate of taxation was 18%. Overnight, they increased it to 36%. There is nothing to stop government from increasing that 36 to 50. So there is a very specific system that has been defined, that has been derived globally for governments to get the revenue it needs to meet the obligations and responsibilities that it has, and that's taxation. Please don't mix up taxation with profit. That profit motive in government is an extremely dangerous concept, and we should not go in that direction. So this is something that is very fundamental. So, you know, it's unfortunate that this whole story about SOE restructuring is turning towards privatization, because it's not only, privatization is a very small thing, but when we talk about privatization, we shouldn't be thinking of privatization in terms of profit and loss or in terms of cash flow, but we should be thinking of privatization in terms of how it can benefit society in terms of providing goods and services of good price, good quality, and decent availability, right? This is the fundamental thing, and the lack of understanding among society of these concepts is one of the biggest drawbacks that we have, not just for SOE reform, but for reform of any type, okay? And I know, do we have a lot more time?
Not really, no.
Okay.
This will be the final round, and then we'll have to open on.
And I think this is a very important point that I want to leave with all of you all. It's not just about SOE reform, but it's about reform in general. All of us today are focused on economic reforms, okay? But economic reforms, is not what's going to take this country into another place. Just think about this. We have had 16 IMF programs before the one we signed very recently, before the 17th one. Can any of you think how the 17th one is going to be any different than the 16 previously? Can any one of you say how or why the 17th is going to be any different than the other 16? Right? Because the problems we face in this country is not economic. The fundamental issues that we face in this country is about governance. I think that was spoken about here. And unless we correct the governance structures of this country and the way the country is governed and the way, right, we will never overcome the economic issues. We will back a number of times. Right? So we need to think, you know, fundamentally reform. Think of the word reform. It's about forming anew, right? We need to move away from the way we have done things over the last 75 years, right? Because that has brought us to a huge economic crisis, to a huge crisis in this country. And remember this, we've not only had economic crisis, we've had other crises in this country as well. We fought there was a 30-year war where we fought amongst each other. Right? It's a huge crisis, right? So we have to do things differently going forward. And it is not only about SOE reform, but it's about other reform as well. And the first thing that we need to do when we ask ourselves how we need to make this change is to look at things anew and to look at things differently. Do not get caught in the misinformation of the past, because if you do, that's what's going to ruin the future. So we need to look at this completely anew, and that to me is the biggest obstacle we have, not just in terms of SOE reform, but in terms of reforms in general.
Thank you, Mr. Shah. So with that, we have more questions, but it will be time for the audience. If you have any clarifications further that you need to direct to our panelists, this is time for you to direct your questions. Even we are virtually present, and we invite all of you to direct your questions if you have any further clarifications, or else we can move on for the future other questions before the closure.
Sudhi, මම ඇත්තටම ප්‍රශ්නයකට අහනවට වඩා මට තියෙන එක්ස්පීරියන්ස් එකත් එක්ක මට ෂෙයා කරගන්න අවශ්‍යයි සමහර පැනල් මෙම්බර්ස්ලා කියපු කාරණා එක්ක. එකක් තමයි අපි ඔක්කොම දන්නවා පබ්ලික් මේක එක කොටසක් විතරයි මේ රට දුප්පත් වෙන්න තියෙන. පබ්ලික් සෙක්ටර් එකේ එම්ප්ලොයිමන්ට් කාඩ් එක අවුරුදු 10ක් විතර ඇතුළත 90% වැඩි වෙන්නේ. ඒතකොට ඒ කාඩ් එක වැඩි වෙන්නේ කවුරුත් පබ්ලික් සර්වන්ට්ලා ඉල්ලලා නෙවෙයි. right? අපි ඉල්ලලා නෙවෙයි. එතකොට අපි 2004 දී ගන්නකොටත් අපි කිව්වා මේක ඔල්ටර්නටිව් 10000 ගෙවන්න පුළුවන් නම් ගෙවන්න ග්‍රැජුවේට්ස්ලට මේක ගන්න එපා. 2012 අරගත්තට පස්සේ ආයෙ 2016 ගන්නවා. ඒ ගන්නකොටත් අවුරුදු 45 වෙනකන් ගන්න. 13 14 15 නෙවෙයි. right? එතකොට සැලරි බිල් එක කොච්චර යනවද? I was in public administration loan discussion එක chamber එක ගිහලා තමයි 5 year leave එක දුන්නේ. අඩු ගානේ public sector එක 5 years වැඩ කරන්න private sector එකේ. lights bill වතුර bill එක වැඩි කරන්න. මම හිතන්නේ හැම sector එකකම cabinet papers දාලා තියෙනවා. අපිට තිබ්බ ප්‍රශ්නේ තමයි 65%කට වතුර දෙනකොට අයි 100%ක් මිනිස්සු වතුර ගන්න මිනිස්සු මේ bill එක ගෙවන්නේ. මොකද they are paying සුයුග වලින් හරි පර්ප් වලින් හරි ඒගොල්ලෝ ගෙවනවා. local government election, then provincial government election, then general election, then presidential election. කිසිම government එකක් ඒව වැඩි කරේ නැහැ. එතකොට එහෙම වුණාම ඒව පාඩු වෙනවා තමයි. පැඩි මාකටිං බෝඩ්. මේ ගන්නකොට කියනවා කම්පියුටර් ගන්න ගන්නට නෙවෙයි අපි ගන්නවනේ සර්ටිෆයි ගන්නට. විකුණනකොට අපි මාකට් එකට නෙවෙයි ඊට අඩුවෙන් කවදාවත් පැඩි මාකටිං බෝඩ් ලාභ වෙන්නේ නැහැ. ඒතකොට ඒක වෙන විදියකට හිතන්න ඕන. මේ විදියට හැම කාරණයක්ම ගත්තාම අපිට මොන දෙන්නලා තියෙන විදිය ඒක. ඒතර පබ්ලික් එන්ටර්ප්‍රයිස් වල 150ක් කිසිම ප්‍රශ්නයක් නැතුව වහන්න පුළුවන්. කිසිම හේතුවක් නැතුව දාපුවා තියෙනවා. මම දැන් හයිවේස් එකේ මම කම්පැනිස් 5ක් වහනවා. එක තේරුමක් නැහැ. බස් කම්පැනියක් දානවා කාට හරි හම්බ කරන්න දෙනවා. තව කම්පැනියක් දානවා තව කාට හරි. They are not a public servant. ඒ ඔක්කොම කියන so called smart private sector එකෙන් ආපු අය තමයි. Right? The brokers. All unsolicited proposal. Right? දැන් අපි කතා කරන මේ public enterprise වල මුළු damage එක සමහර one project එකකින් කරලා තියෙනවා. එක project තියෙන abandon කරපු highways එකේ 15 billion. Right? එතකොට දැන් ඒව කවුද ගෙන ආවේ? කොහොමද ඒවා තීරණය කරලා තියෙන්නේ? හරි ප්‍රශ්න. ඒක නිසා මගේ අදහස තමයි ඇත්තටම මමත් විශ්වාස කරනවා රිෆෝම් කරන්න ඕන ඉන්ස්ටිටියුෂන්ස් තියෙනවා. අනිවාර්යයෙන්. ඒ කියන්නේ අපි කරන්න ඕනේ නෑ ඒවා. අපේ රෝල් එක නෙවෙයි. ඒවා දෙන්න ඕන ප්‍රයිවට් සෙක්ටර්ට. ඇයි අපි කන්ස්ට්‍රක්ෂන් කරන්නේ? ඒ වගේ ගොඩක් ඒවා තියෙනවා දෙන්න. ඒ ටික දෙන්න. අනිත් එක තමයි අපි දෙන විදිය. දැන් මමම දන්නවා. එක වෙලාවක නා හම්බන්තොට ගුවන්තොටුපළ දෙන්න කන්ස්ට්‍රක්ෂන් කොස්ට් එකට. ඒතර මම ලියලා දැන් මම ගයක් හදාගෙන තියෙනවා නම් හම්බන්තොට රේල් එකත් ඇවිල්ලා හයිවේස් උත් ඇවිල්ලා එයාපෝට් එක මේ වරායත් ආවහම ඇයි මම ඒ මුදලට දෙන්නේ? ECT එක දෙන්න කියන්නේ බුක් වැලියු එකට. right? ඒතකොට ඒවට විරුද්ධ වෙනකොට ගෙවන්න වෙන්නේ කෝපරේට් සෙක්ටර් එකේ බිල නෙවෙයි අපිට. අපි කෙලිම පොසිෂන් එකෙන්ම යන්න වෙන්නේ. right? ඒක නිසා ප්‍රධානම කාරණේ තමයි මේකෙදි transparency must. Transparency must. ඒ කියන්නේ හැමෝටම තේරෙන්න ඕන මේක කම්පිටිටිව්නස් එක ඕපන්නස් එක හරියටම තියෙනවා කියන එක. ඒක අත්‍යවශ්‍යයි. දෙවෙනි එක තමයි රියල් වැලියු එකට එහා යන්න ඕන. රියල් වැලියු එකක් ප්‍රොපර්ටි එක තියෙනවා එකට එහාට යන්න ඕන මේක. ඒක නිසා ඒ ටික හරිම වැදගත් වෙනවා මේ පබ්ලික් එන්ටර්ප්‍රයිස් රිෆෝම් එකේදී. ගොඩක් ඒවා තියෙනවා රිෆෝම් කරන්න අවශ්‍යයි. ප්‍රයිවට් සෙක්ටර් වඩා හොඳින් කරන්න පුළුවන් ඒවා තියෙනවා. ඒවා කරන්න ඕන. ඒක ගැන කිසිම එකක් නැහැ. ඒ වගේම මාජිනල් කොටස් වල ප්‍රොටෙක්ෂන් එක අනිවාර්යෙන් බලන්න ඕනේ. දැන් රේල්වේ ට්‍රාන්ස්පෝර්ට් ගත්තහම ඒ කොස්ට් එක සීසන් එකට දෙනවා 107ට සීසන් එකක් දෙනවා 106ක් යන ඔපරේෂන් කොස්ට් එක. ඒ සීසන් එකෙන් කිසිම ලාභයක් නැහැ. සීසන් එක වැඩි කරනවා නම් අපි සජෙස්ට් කරන්නේ සීසන් එක වැඩි කරන්න ඕන අන්ඩර් ප්‍රිවිලේජ් අයට නොමිලේ දුන්නත් කමක් නැහැ. සෝෂල් නෙට්වර්ක් එකක් ඕන. ඉතින් ඒක නිසා ප්‍රයිසින් පොලිසි එකට කවුරු හරි ප්‍රයිවට් සෙක්ටර් එක රන් කරනවා නම් ඒ මාර්ජිනයිස් ගෲප් එක ප්‍රොටෙක්ට් වෙන විදිය රජයේ මෙකනිසම් එකක් අවශ්‍යයි. ඕපන් ක්‍රමය අවශ්‍යයි. මේ ටික කරනවා නම් ගොඩක් දේවල් තියෙනවා. හැබැයි ඒ වගේම ඉන්වෙස්ට්මන්ට් කියන එක, පබ්ලික් ඉන්වෙස්ට්මන්ට් කියන එක, ලෝන්, unsolicited proposal, ඒ පැත්තෙන් වෙන ඩැමේජ් එක මීට සාපේක්ෂව වැඩි කියලා මට හිතෙන්නේ. ඒකත් රිෆෝම් වෙන්න ඕන. Thank you.
Thomas Misuti Mahatma. Any more questions that you may have to clarify?
Yeah, this is an open question to Mr. Shah. I think you said that there is a policy has been approved by the cabinet where some major principles has been introduced to move the SOEs funding through state banks or rather financial sector. So my question is how the future requirements will be financed, and what will happen to the existing finances that have been taken from the banking sector? What is the fate of it? And my third question is, have you finalized the names of state-owned enterprises which are going to be restructured under this program?
So on the link between SOEs and state banks, what we are recommending is that yes, there are facilities that are there at the moment. You need to move away from them gradually. Particularly, we need to take away the treasury guarantees. Right, that's number one. Number two, also, there are single borrower limits. Yeah, so we need all of these need to be introduced, right? So that you build financial discipline within the SOE sector. At the same time, you safeguard the operations of the banking system, whether they are private banks or state banks. And fundamentally, if you can transform the SOEs that government retains into organizations that are financially strong, right, then it should be able to go to any bank and be able to get its requirement. So that's the principle that we are looking at. But to move from where we are to get to that point, you can't do this overnight. There is a transition period. So, and the transition period again depends on entity to entity. There are some entities which you might be able to do it fairly quickly. There may be other entities where it might take longer than that. So we've got to be very entity specific. No, not. So that's an ongoing process.
My question is also to Mr. Shah. And you said that the criterion has been now finalized and the cabinet approval has been already obtained. But in the process, I think I represent SOE. But even the senior management of the board of directors were not consulted properly. I mean, I don't think this committee don't understand well what are our issues at the moment. Because we have been struggling with the treasury for nearly 12 years to increase our tariffs and to have a cost-reflective tariff. Still now, the government has accepted it as a policy, but still last year's increase even were not what we have requested. So we are losing every month to 2.5 billion per month.
What's the enterprise? Sorry.
NWSTB.
Sorry?
NWSTB, Water Board.
Water Board doesn't come under our unit. That is being handled by the ministry itself.
I mean, restructuring, but our view is now we have been struggling with treasury for last 10 to 12 years. Many secretaries were fighting. Even our act says the tariff can be approved by the minister with the consent of the finance minister. But the treasury officials get on to that and they want to put it to the cabinet because it is not in the act, right? It is given the authority to the minister with the consent of this one. The finance ministers have now the president being the finance minister, he has been consented, but still. Once in February, we proposed once the electricity tariff increase, we are going to lose 500 million per month, another additional. So we have within 3 days we have put our proposal from February. Now more than 10 meetings, still not approved. Right? Even the president through the minister, is in agreement as a policy. but still not approved. So we are that for last 4 months we have been now losing 10 billion. Right? Until last year, we were anyhow paying our loans and make the expansion, everything because we had a 12,000 card approved card, but still now we are running at 8,700, right? So we have well managed public organization. Right now, how can we expand to double the consumer base? Now running even about 20% less card, right? And we were equal with the CEB 10 years before. Now CEB has 25,000. I mean, I don't misunderstand the CEB senior officers if they are there, but we are now 8,300. We have done all our reform. Even with the crisis came. With the ADB, we discussed and agreed for a reform program. By around August, September, we are ready with our reform program, right? But the Treasury don't want to go ahead because they are planning a reform program. They want to postpone our one for this year, right? So this is what is happening. They have 4 DSTs now and 10 departments. But with the banks, we were agreeing for restructuring, and they said within 1 week they will give us that meeting was held in 3rd April, and she was, I can remember there, and still it was not approved. The one DST is highly promoting, why don't you approve it? The other DST is not approving, right?
So you raise a very valid point, and which is why, when I made my opening remarks, I said that whilst government has every right to provide subsidies to the citizens, Dhananath has a different view, and I agree with Dhananath's view that there are different ways in which this can be done. But fundamentally, government has the right to provide a subsidy. Yeah. But I'm very much against the subsidy being parked inside the enterprise. So in your case, I completely agree with you that if the government wants to give a subsidy, the subsidy should be taken into the government's budget rather than park it inside your enterprise. Because the moment you park it inside your enterprise, you can't then provide the services, the public service obligations for which you were formed, you cannot discharge because you're challenged, because you're financially constrained. So I fully agree with what you're saying, and these are some of the changes that we need to bring in. Yeah. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, but the water board, the CPC, the CEB, the CTB, those don't come under our purview, and they are being handled by the respective ministries.
Yes, and our recommendation is first, I think we should reform or restructure the finance ministry itself, because it has 10 departments and under 4 DSTs and the central bank even. Because they want us to borrow from the local banks, right? Around 2015-16, right? We went for that one. So at that time, all the risk and risk is done. AWPR at about 9.5 and so on. But it went to now 27, 28 last year, end of last year and beginning of this year, right? But the central bank or nobody control it, right? It is an unexpected situation. But because of that only, we were stuck with the cash flow and we couldn't repay their loans. And we are now defaulted them, local banks, by nearly 12 billion last year, by end of last year. So, but still, within 10 years from last, our tariff increase was done in 2012. So last year, tariff increase was given, it is not which we have requested. Now this treasury is not paying the local bank, and the banking structure will also collapse if they are not taking decisions at right time. That's all.
Thank you very much. Do we have any more questions from the audience? Yes.
I'm Samant Serananth, Senior Consultant from SLIDA. My question is for any of the eminent panelists, maybe Mr. Peter de Almeida. Every time we are having this topic on table, restructuring of state-owned enterprises, we have a huge resistance from employees and also trade unions. So also this a moment ago, in WSD was saying that about their views on that. So what is, my question is, what is your views? What are your views? And also, what are your recommendations to handle the resistance from trade unions and employees' actions on restructuring?
Okay, so I don't speak for all the trade unions, obviously, and I certainly don't speak for the public sector trade unions. And I myself have been involved in business. I had an association with the CMU when I was 15 years old, and now I've come back, having been in business, having run a technology company with 250 employees. Is my mic on? Can you all hear me? Okay, 250 employees in information technology. And we started with the investment of 30 million. When I exited the company, we are doing a top line of $30 million. So we have run companies. So I have come back in retirement to help in the unions because our workers are very badly off. I think one of the things that reforms must look at is how do we sustain the living standards of our people? Because there's no point doing any reform if you can't lift the living standards of our people. And that is falling. There's no point in anybody doing any reforms or whatever if you don't reform the system in a way that the living standard, it's collapsing. I go to meet, yesterday I spoke at an apparel factory. They all stood there, those ladies. I mean, it's absurd. You know. So that's the point I was making about the subsidies government provides. The companies don't take enough care of them. So that they rely on government services to come to work even. Now, for example, the cost, you know, Suresh, there's one worker who comes to a factory in Swerakeyal. His cost to come to work from Horana in his motorcycle, 22,000. So we can say increase fuel subsidy, remove it, and all that well and good. How does it affect the lives of his salary is 60,000. He has worked for 20 years. 60,000 salary. That also base salary of 30,000. Incentive bonus, production bonus, this bonus, that bonus. Who hamadam at 10 on. Avilla, visit the transport. What can he do? So what is the point in doing reforms if you are not looking at the livelihoods of our people? This is where the private sector, they are living in another world. You see, they must look at the reality. Maybe healthcare. That's why we are suspicious. Not because you must reform. We go to companies now and tell them how they should reform. We went to a large conglomerate, I'll tell you. We said, you're wasting as a union because we studied their balance sheet. We studied their balance sheet, we studied their business model, and we said, you must sack your manager. Because we showed them. Studying the balance sheet, we said, what the hell is he doing? How is he running this company down like this? So we are interested in protecting the companies we work for. And now we are educating our workers on balance sheet, business model, and they get a shock now when we go and negotiate like this. So to answer your question, madam, you know, we are suspicious because the private sector is not acting in the interest of the public, the larger people of this country. Otherwise, they will do something about the healthcare falling. It's collapsing. You know. So what is the point of reforms if it doesn't touch the lives of ordinary people? Can I respond? So suspicion. Answer your question. Yes, let's have a representative group of people who sit down and tackle this problem. What are the strategic assets? Not in a rush, no. What are the strategic assets that we need to recover this company? Look at the Houseman report. He's talking about export diversification. This structural reform will not change export diversification. No? It will bring you some extra money into the revenue. Who spends this money? This corrupt government. They'll pocket it or they'll do something crazy with it. But export diversification, it's been going on for the last 10 years. What has the private sector done? We are ready to have a conversation on that. What is the strategy of the government to diversify export? Foreign direct investment. They are trying to introduce a single law, labor law. Investors are coming because our law is loose. No. Houseman report says the labor laws are not a constraint for investment in this country. But the Employees Federation says, my God, huge problem. Change the Termination of Employment Act, hire and fire. Reform that. What is the real problem? Corruption. Last example I'll give you. That's why we are concerned when this set of people appoint people to solve the problem. They cause the problem. Can you trust them? Will you trust them? You won't trust them. Final point on this restructuring and all that. Taisei, Japanese company, said a minister asked for a bribe. The Japanese ambassador said that. What did they do? He resigned under the previous president. New president came, appointed a commission and said, no such thing happened. The Japanese government is going to be happy. You call the Japanese ambassador a liar. He's a representative of the Japanese government. This kind of administration, and the president goes to parliament and says, the Japanese are going to call a consortium of all the creditors. They said, within 1 hour, they said, no such agreement from us. So it is this kind of government that's going to do these reforms in the interest of the public. Now you see why we are suspicious. This is why we are suspicious. This has nothing to do. Yes, reforms are important. Structural reforms are important. Let's have those conversations. When I was in the bank union, we spoke to the banks. No, we told the People's Bank, why are you lending money to governments? Henchayas. We asked the question, not the chamber, or sorry, I don't want to keep saying, I just keep talking about employee organized. They didn't say that. So, telecom, which was semi-privatized, just sell it. To Suresh's question, dilute, let both parties dilute. Government will dilute a little, Maxis will dilute a little, not sell our share. Get a good valuation, dilution, no? What's the big deal? I'll take 5%, you take 10%, whatever. You get some money. Then how are you going to invest that for infrastructure development of telecom? Basics, no? You don't need a big committee to figure this out. What's the problem? But telecom privatized. Previous presidents appointed their catchers on the board. We have done multi-million business at telecom. Not a cent did the engineers ask us. Not 1 cent. But they appointed chairman and board members who then disqualified us because we are not ready to pay money. And this goes on. So this has nothing to do with, and it was privatized. So, yes, suspicious, madam. Yes, suspicious. Because the people who are doing this are not honorable people.
Miss, your question was from an employee's perspective, these the privatizations, how they will impact the employees, right? That was fundamentally your question.
Yeah, also how to, if you are in the path of restructuring, have you conquered this issue of trade union?
Yeah, so from the discussions that we have had with some of the trade unions, what comes out is that there are 3 fundamental concerns, right? First concern is their security of their employment. The second concern is they have, over the years, there are certain facilities that the respective enterprises have provided these employees. They want those safeguarded. And the third challenge that they see is who will be the investor, right? So these are the 3 fundamental questions that have been raised. And in terms of security of employment, the Sri Lankan legal system does not allow any entity to just fire anyone, right? So employees are protected by the legal system of the country, and also all benefits that employees have earned over the years. There are, to start with, there are collective agreements, and then even through practice, right? If benefits have accrued to employees over a certain period of time, then those automatically continue. So there is safety in that as well, right? And thirdly, in terms of the investor, we are very conscious that we need to bring in investors into these enterprises who have good knowledge of the sector and who have the financial strength to be able to invest in these enterprises and grow these enterprises, right? So frankly, I don't see, and I really don't see why the employees need to be concerned. I think it's just a question of them getting to understand the reality of the situation. And my experience in talking to in talking to some of these trade unions is that once we have the exchange of ideas and once we put our perspective on the table, they don't necessarily agree with everything we say, but they go away much more comfortable than when they came back and sat down with us, right? So very important. The legislation of the country safeguards employment, safeguards employee benefits, and in terms of bringing the investors, we will do whatever we can to bring the right investors into these enterprises. So that's my response to you on that.
Suresh, quick one. They are trying to change the labor regulations. They are now talking about changing the Termination of Worker Employment Act, termination of night work for women. So you see, it's running parallel. So there is that's why you have to understand the whole thing, you know. This is this. But on the other hand, they're changing, and it's quite right. They're changing these laws, particularly the Termination of Employment of Workers Act. And the Federation came and said, we must be able to hire and fire. And the Houseman report specifically says the Termination of Employment of Workers Act is not a constraint for investment. Harvard, CID, study, Center for International Development Study, specifically. So to your point, they're changing that.
No, but you may. I have heard about the change, but at the same time, I must say that the labor regulations, just like SOE reforms, is probably a completely is a subject. So you can't take labor reforms only in the context of SOE reforms. I think that's a completely different subject. I mean, you need to address it
there may be a parallel. That's what
My apologies, gentlemen. I have to intervene as we are running out of the time. It has been certainly an interactive session from the questions, but we are going to conclude the Q&A session from this, and we are going to wind up. And to sum up everything in the closure. Yes.
Just 1 minute. My point is restructuring is important for any entity. The question is, where do we want to start the restructuring? My point is you have to restructure government. That's why we came out and fought in the Aragali and said this system must change. As long as a rotten system prevails, any changes you make is going to be not going to be beneficial. Having said that, to Dharnath's point, where can we reform? That's a discussion we can have, and it should be a transparent process. And finally, any reforms must ultimately, one, ensure that the government retains essential public services. We cannot let public services run down just because of profit. Profit will terminate bad services that they can't provide, non-profitable, poor areas, transport, you know this, I don't have to explain. So we must protect, there's a duty to protect public services, and the government must act, and we must protect them. At the same time, we must ensure that any reforms, the reflection of the reforms can only mean that the standard of living of our people must go up. And we cannot do any of these things unless we address the major elephant in the room, corruption. And we have to stand up against corruption. Public sector, private sector, advocate, everybody must stand up and say, we are against this. And we must come back to a system where we can have a certain amount of government, starting with have the elections. I'm not a big supporter of the parties who are contesting. Have the elections, get some democratic framework going. Then these things will become somewhat meaningful. But in the absence of these, it looks like a very suspicious attempt to break up our assets, sell them to the cheapest bidder.
Thank you very much, Mr. Peter T. Almeida, Deputy General Secretary, the Ceylon Mercantile Industrial and General Workers Union. And we go to Mr. Dhananath Fernando, the final remarks that you have to sum up today's session.
As Peter said, we are all standing against the corruption, but I would like to go to the root cause. In my view, the root cause is this SOEs, because that has been the backyard and the political tool that the politicians have been using to make money and to be corrupted. And that's why we are making losses, and that's why it's an impact on you. They are taxing all of us for 6 years just to cover the 8 months of losses in just single institute. And that's why we need to do reforms. And of course, we have to have the governance structures. That's paramount important. We have to be competitive on the process. It has to be transparent. The clock is running, so it has to be faster as well. Unfortunately, I wish we could have more time to expand these reforms and have more discussions, but we are running out of the clock. We are just hitting the wall, and we can see the wall, and we have already in certain sectors, we hit the wall, and we can't run businesses like this. So that's why it's important. The transparency is paramount, but the root cause is these SOEs are not national assets. These are not even national liabilities. These are fraudulent organizations run by the politicians to employ their unemployable relatives. And that's the reason, and as it was someone said, when politics becomes profitable, the only manufacturing output would be poverty. And that's why we have to restructure, and that's the only way that we can improve the quality of life of all of us, the benefit for the people, and we have to make sure that the politics should not be profitable, because then the manufacturing product could be poverty.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dhananath Fernando, Chief Executive Officer, Advocata. We go on to Dr. Chatrali Anage.
So I think the presenter is making the same point. I'm also with the same page on that. I think as the citizens of Sri Lanka, we all have been witnessing the things that we went through in the last couple of years, and we all in a one page that the reforms has to be made. So there's no question about it. So so on the thing is how we are going to make this change. So that's where everyone is coming up with different alternatives, but like I highlighted, the main thing that I would always say, the governance. If irrespective of the party, if we have the proper governance and if we are having an agreement of a one national policy, whatever the party or whoever comes to power, we can have a future if we are to maintain that. So that's the take-home message I would like to say, that we all need to stand on a good governance framework, and that will resolve most of the problems that we were discussing today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chaitanya, Senior Lecturer, Department of Finance, University of Canada. And coming to you, Mr. Suresh Shah. What are your closures?
Yeah, so I will address the biggest fallacy around state-owned enterprises. People speak of these enterprises as national assets. You know, I would never classify a commercial enterprise, whether it's public sector or private sector, as a national asset. Because in my mind, national assets are those assets that need to be leveraged to develop a country, right? And from this perspective, if you think what our real national assets are, I would say they are the youth of our country because they are the future. It is the sea, the ocean that surrounds us because there is a lot that you can extract from the ocean. It is the environment that we have. You know, we are a nation that can produce a lot of renewable energy, right? This is a national asset. It's the soil of our country, which is extremely fertile. You plant something, you put a seed, it grows. That is a national asset. It is the healthcare system that we have in our country. It is the education system that we have in our country. These are some of the national assets. And you compare these with any commercial enterprise and you ask yourself the question, can you even say, you take any enterprise, private or public sector, and ask the question, is this really a national asset? Or is it our education system? Or is it our irrigation system? Or is it our youth? Okay. These are our national assets. And this is where, as a country, we need to invest our scarce resources, our limited resources. It is in these assets that we need to invest our resources so that tomorrow we will have a country which is better than the country we have had for the last 75 years. So we need to move away from this fallacy of saying these commercial enterprises are assets, because the minute we start saying that, we start focusing on putting our resources onto those assets, and then we ignore the real assets that we have. And this is what we have done over the last 75 years. We have ignored our real assets because we have gone behind these small things saying these are our assets. We need to change this. We need to relook at this whole framework. Our mindset needs to change. And the day we do that and really focus on the assets that we have and invest our limited resources behind those assets, tomorrow will be very different from the 75 years we have had.
Thank you very much, Mr. Suresh Shah. Mr. Suresh Shah, Director General, State-Owned Enterprise Restructuring Unit, Ministry of Finance. Ladies and gentlemen, let me please give a huge round of applause to our panelists for sharing their expertise, and the need of the hour is to talk of the town, which is about the SOA structure. Thank you very much for your active participation, everyone here present in person and also whoever that have joined through the virtual platforms. And do stay tuned for the future panel discussions that will be directed by SLIDA. Thank you very much for the organizers and all the very best. Thank you very much.